Hello, everybody. This is going to be 15.6 Mass Culture in the 1950s. And so we're going to start with a quote from Jack Kerouac in his book On the Road, where he says, "Whither goest thou, America, in thy shiny car in the night?" Very cool sort of quote. I love that quote. Anyway, so our objectives, we're going to examine the rise of the suburbs and growth of the interstate highway system, explain the causes and effects of prosperity on consumers in the 50s, discuss post war changes in family life, discuss changes in education, and describe the new forms of mass culture coming out too. So let's start with the suburbs. This is a not a new idea, but the rise in them and the popularity and the boom in them really was new. So people were coming back from war. They found there was no depression. They had good jobs. The GI Bill meant that returning soldiers could get a home loan very easily as long as you were white. And so a lot of them moved to suburbs that were being built around the country during this time. Suburbs offered sort of small, cheap, kind of very samey sort of houses that the veterans could afford. And also, for the first time, you could live in the suburbs and not have to go in the city for things like shopping and entertainment. We see the rise of malls during this time, too. Um, Many of these suburbs were also restricted to white and or Christian families. Many of them had certain housing contracts that you had to sign that segregated them and kept them only one race. We'll see actually this ends in 1948. So here's one of the new suburbs, often called Levitt towns. These were towns that were created by the two Levitt brothers in places like Long Island and New York and out in the suburbs of Pennsylvania. And you can see these houses all do look very samey. Now, Congress also passed the Interstate Highway Act to connect these cities. It was good for travel, it was good for trade, and like I think I already mentioned, it was good for national defense. If you need to get tanks from New York to California, interstate highways are important for that. Also, not surprisingly, people use them for vacations. So we see that Disneyland opened during this time. The cars were also affordable following World War II, and they were giant gas guzzlers the size of a building during the 1950s, and people began to depend on cars as their main mode of transportation. In places like Los Angeles, we see they got rid of their public transit and put in a bunch of highways instead, which has helped lead to a lot of traffic problems in LA. So, this is what the interstate highway system looks like in action. And this is a typical 1950s car. Look at those fins on the back. It's a car that thinks it's a house, basically. Anyway, let's look at increased consumption during this time, too. After the war, America was buying as much as they could. This is the idea of consumerism. And this is partially because the median family income, how much a family made per year, post taxes, was going up during this time. And we also see that new stuff, new technologies were going on the market. A lot of these things were focused on helping women do their work in the house very quickly, like washing machines, dryers, refrigerators. But we also see that TVs became a big thing. 9 out of every 10 houses had a TV in it by 1959, which is amazing considering that they are very new technology. So here is typical 1950s advertising. A lot of it did feature women with appliances, working appliances, kind of meant to head fake towards the idea that women were supposed to be in the home during this time. We also see families and communities change during the 50s. In the 1950s, thanks to men coming back from the war and going back to work, women were expected to go back home. And we see that this new ideal of what a family should look like changes during this time period, with the woman being the homemaker, the man being the breadwinner, and having 2.5 children in the front yard with a dog and a white picket fence. People idolized what was called the nuclear family: the husband, the wife, the kids, living in the suburbs. It was what you saw in TV sitcoms in the time. Now, in the 50s and 60s, some women did fight back against this expectation we're going to see. So here is a nuclear family in the sitcom Leave It to Beaver: Mom, Dad, Wally, and the Beeve. And this is partially thanks to the baby boom. And a lot of, thanks to the baby boom also, a lot of people started to focus on their children. They had a lot of children to take care of during this time. A guy named Dr. Benjamin Spock released a famous book on how to raise children, focusing on pampering them and making them feel special and important. A lot of money was spent on basically whatever the kids wanted and needed, which helped the economy out a lot. We also see that religion's coming back in a big way. Remember, we're fighting communists, and communists are godless, according to the propaganda. So evangelists like Billy Graham started to attract millions of revivalists coming back to Jesus. We also saw this has an impact in things like the Pledge of Allegiance. This is when we added the words under God to the Pledge of Allegiance. Now, lastly, we also saw a rise of new medical innovations during this time, including a polio vaccine created by Jonas Salk, which saved the lives of, you know, so many polio victims of the 1950s and 60s. So here's one of Dr. Spock's books, and here's Billy Graham, who once said, "My home is in heaven. I'm just traveling through to this world." Graham was a spiritual advisor to decades worth of presidents. And here are people being given the polio vaccine. My dad was one of the first kids they tried this vaccine out on. Now, let's look at educational opportunities. As wealth and technology increased, so did the number of kids going to schools. Many states guaranteed that every child would have at least a high school education. And this is partially political because we were losing the space race. We needed a bunch of smart American kids to go up against the commies. And so let's get them into college. California came up with what is called the California Master Plan, where they help to fund research universities, state colleges, and community colleges to make sure that more and more students could go to some sort of college. And we see the US government actually helps to fund higher education during this time, too. So, for instance, here's UMSL, started in 1963, and St. Louis Community College started in 1962. These are both sort of examples of how we're expanding the access to education during this time. Now, one of the most important education reforms, and one that we're going to come back to in the civil rights movement, is Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka, which said that schools had to integrate. You could not be a segregated school system anymore. And it actually said a lot more than that. It said that we should stop all segregation. This was basically, importantly, if you're going to, think about it in terms of the long run and also in terms of the final exam, Brown v. Board of Education more or less overturned Plessy v. Ferguson and started to say that segregation and Jim Crow was illegal. It actually helped. Doing it would actually take for a while. You could tell somebody the law says this, but unless you force them to listen to it, they're just going to keep doing what they're doing. So it took enforcing much of the 1960s, and we still do see occasionally up through today that this is a thing. So here's Linda Brown sitting on the steps of the Supreme Court with her, I believe it's her lawyer, with the newspaper that says High Court bans segregation in public schools. Now, let's look at TV real quick. TV was the thing this year. More people were staying homes than going to the movies and watching things like Howdy Doody, The Mickey Mouse Club, sports, news, entertainment. All of this was coming in during this time. Families were watching sitcoms like I Love Lucy and Leave It to Beaver. We see that TV dinners are becoming a thing during this time, even. People were watching, like I said, sports news, and if you watched the sitcoms, they had the nuclear family front and center. Many politicians also began advertising. We mentioned that Dwight Eisenhower basically sold himself as almost as a commodity on TV when he was running for president. So here's an ad for TV dinners during this time, a dinner that everyone can eat around the tube there. Here is an example of the Mickey Mouse Club, which really, why would you ever nickname a child Moochie or Cubby? Like, why would you do that? Anyway, here is also a clip from the I Like Ike commercials of that time.